Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. Monday night, time to update the top 25 power rankings. Heading into next week, and it continues to be chaos in the landscape of college football. The way I want to get into this conversation is really talk about the tiers that we have. Like, you look at the top three teams, Texas, Oregon, Ohio State. Those are three teams, and we're going to get into it, that you look at and just say you don't have many question marks about what those three teams are going to be in 2024. And as you get down the list, all of a sudden, like, these are good football teams that you suddenly start to have a lot of question marks about what they can be at the highest level of the sport. Fired up to get into it. Now, before we do, and as always, Dale, you saw it before we even went live. Like, you got some serious problems with these top 25 power rankings. I'm sure many of y'all listening do as well. I think that's why it's probably my favorite episode to do every single week, just talking ball with you guys in the comments section. So let it fly, whether you agree, whether you disagree, all the support. It means the absolute world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, let's start at the top here. Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, my top three teams. Look, I know Ohio State just lost to Oregon, but the way they play, I think they got Oregon. Oregon played some very, very good football. I watched that game back this morning. I left that Oregon Ohio State game saying that those are two of the best teams in the country. And I think most importantly, Will Howard answered a lot of questions that I had about him playing in the biggest moments, because I thought he was, outside of that last play where he slid a little bit late, he was very sharp that whole game against Oregon.
And I have no issue. I would frankly leave Ohio State in that top contender list, because I think you said it. Will Howard, that was big-time football from him. And I didn't even know that he'd be able to have that, where they weren't really running the ball in the second half, and he was just kind of marching them down, throwing it. Jeremiah Smith is a monster, so they have that real number one threat who I think is really a handful in single coverage, man-to-man kind of systems. And then I look like that defense is still very good. I want more from that defensive line for sure. That was really, really disappointing, I think. And Denzel Burks certainly didn't play his best game, but that's still a good defense. So I'm good with them staying in the contender category. I think Penn State should be up there, though. I look at, and I've heard this song and dance from Penn State where they win all their games up until they play in Ohio State or in Michigan in the last couple of years, and then their offense falls apart. But I look at the way Colton Nicky's got that offense running. They're doing a much better job getting their best players like Tyler Warren or Nick Singleton in the positions to make plays and exploit defenses. And that was just something they couldn't do last year. They had no creativity. They couldn't get their big dogs involved. I think when they go see those big dogs, I think that they can get their players in positions to make plays. And if they can, their defense to me still might be the best defense in the country.
Penn State is a massively different team than what we saw in 2023. And you said it best. I don't think a lot of people appreciate it. And that's kind of why I have Penn State number 5 in that tier below. There are some questions I have about Penn State, but I do want to start by giving them their flowers. Like, this offense is massively different. I think Drew has taken a step. My biggest concern about Penn State, Dill, are they a little over-reliant on Tyler Warren? And Tyler Warren's a dude. Like, I am completely okay with him being a centerpiece and to get him involved in a ton of different ways, just throwing the kitchen sink at USC. I don't think they have difference makers at the wide receiver position. I think if teams can figure out how to try to take Tyler Warren away, I do have some question marks about Penn State's passing attack being as explosive as it needs to be to beat some.
And I don't think it's going to be wildly explosive, but I did think Julian Fleming made some big plays late in that football game that give me some encouragement, because that is probably the one question is, do they have top-end elite play at the wide receiver spot? And I'd probably venture to say no, but they're great at tight end. They have a really, really good offensive line, and they got great running backs, I should say. I think they have enough, but I think you are right. It's like, okay, we've seen this kind of play out. I want to see what they can do against Ohio State, if they can kind of challenge that secondary in the way Oregon was able to. Because if they can't, then I have some questions. But one other thing I should probably mention at the top is Drew Allar feels like he's taken a step in that.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And people will talk about the turnovers that he had. We talked about this yesterday morning. I'm okay with the turnovers because he's actually he's trying to be a difference maker at the quarterback position. Like, everybody wanted to talk about his touchdown to interception ratio last year, which was really dang good. My problem with that conversation was he wasn't making any big time throws, or not that many big time throws. He wasn't really putting the ball in harm's way because he wasn't really trying to fit it in tight windows. Now he's kind of taking that approach, like, I'm going to be a difference maker at the quarterback position. I like it. Maybe I am a little bit low on Penn State, and maybe it has to do with just me watching Penn State kind of bump their heads against teams like Ohio State.
Now, go defend having Miami above Penn State because I look like we're talking about teams that don't have weaknesses.
Love it.
Miami's starting to develop a bit of a glaring weakness, I think, in the secondary. And okay, you can say, well, it's just a couple of big plays, and aside from that, we're really good. I think that argument only like goes so far because I've heard that before from other teams, and they give up big plays when it matters. Miami's given up a lot of them, and they haven't really played any real hammers yet.
100% think that's fair. That's why I have them in the tier below. Like, they're undefeated. I think it starts with Cam Ward. Like, I think he's been the best quarterback in all of college football. And I think that offense is extreme. It's the number one scoring offense in the country. Like, I'm not sure many people are ready to have that conversation, but it's legit one of, if not the best offense that we see in the country. Offensive line, running backs, quarterback, wide receivers, really, really dynamic. Can win in a lot of different ways. You're right. Like, the biggest question mark you have was the biggest question mark we had 6-7 weeks ago heading into 2024. That is the secondary. The reason I have them as the number 4 team is because I do think the secondary can get fixed. And it's some young players that are kind of getting thrusted into the moment. They have to replace a lot. They have some transfers coming in as well. I do think they're kind of like what we were talking about with LSU. Like, I think there's reason to believe these guys get better. They're not just a bunch of bums who you kind of know what they are. Like, I think there's a lot of young players that can continue to get better, and it's a lot more just the discipline, the eye discipline, the busts and coverages, as opposed to you just don't have good players back there.
I agree with that.
That's why I have Miami 4. I can see the argument to have Penn State above them because, again, Penn State's checking a lot of boxes as well. Then you get into and there's an argument to say, like, maybe you have Miami, Penn State as top contenders, but once you get to Alabama, those are when the questions really start to get racked up. Now, Alabama has a roster, just like Georgia, just like Tennessee, that can win a national championship, but you're starting to see massive questions emerge. And Dill, I have Alabama over Georgia, which I think is a hot take in the landscape of college football. Look, Alabama, kind of similar conversation, just some young guys, and he had some turnover. I think the secondary can get better. We certainly have question marks about the defense, but you look at Georgia and say, I got question marks for a couple of different spots on Georgia. One, Carson Beck. He looked really good against Mississippi State. That is one of the worst defenses that we see at the Power 4 level. When you've seen him play some really good defenses, he has struggled massively without Ladd and Brock. And so my question is, can Carson Beck get back to the form that we saw in 2023? I don't think their offensive line is nearly as good as we're used to saying with Georgia. And I think the biggest question mark and the most concerning thing if you're a Georgia fan, Dill, this defense is just not the Georgia defense that we're used to talking about. Now the talent's there, but I would say, one, you don't have a ton of game records right now in the front 7. You had 0 sacks, only 3 tackles for loss against a very bad Mississippi State offensive line. Then you look at the defensive backs, mostly the cornerbacks, and say, we're struggling to play the football in the air. There are a lot of question marks that I have about Georgia. Now, I have them pretty dang high still because I still think the talent's there, and I trust Kirby Smart to right the ship. As we're sitting here right now, the questions, they're starting to pile up for this Georgia Bulldogs program.
No, I agree with you here because fundamentally, I think you have similar questions, frankly, about both teams. Both secondaries have struggled for a good chunk of the year, and both, frankly, defensive fronts aren't playing up to what I think they should be. It's like I look at how talented those guys are on both those units. Like, they need to be more impactful. I don't think either of them are really wrecking games, and that combined with secondaries that are struggling to play the ball, especially when you throw it a little deeper on them, I think gives big questions. I think fundamentally Jalen Milroe is playing at a much higher level than Carson Beck right now. And Carson Beck just doesn't look the same without those two guys. And again, I kind of thought like, okay, well, we'll see if he can find it. We'll see this Georgia. It'll click at some point. Unfortunately, right now, I don't think we've seen it click in a game where it really, really matters for 4 quarters.
Now, both of these teams have exceptional opportunities to answer these questions, right? Georgia playing Texas, Alabama playing Tennessee, both on the road. But we want to see those questions get answered. Dill, probably one of my hottest takes that we have, Clemson. And I'm going to couple Clemson and Texas A&M into the same bunch. And that is the country was ready to write off and throw these teams away both after week 1. I think these teams are both significantly better than the teams that we saw play week 1. I think they're just fundamentally different teams. Connor Wigman and Kate Klubnik. Now, the sample size for Connor Wigman is quite small. Like, it was only that Missouri game where he looked exceptional. Look at Texas A&M. Offensive line has all of a sudden like turned into a strength for Texas A&M, which is extremely encouraging. And then you look at Clemson and say, Dill, this is by far the best Cade Klubnik has looked in his college football career. The flaws in the argument, why people might get upset in the comment section, which I understand this frame of thinking, is small sample size for Connor Wigman at Texas A&M. Clemson hasn't really played anything close to an elite caliber defense. But I do think from the eyeball test, I know the talent's there on both of these rosters, but from the eyeball test, these teams are starting to really turn it up. And you talk about teams that are trending in the right direction. Clemson and Texas A&M are at the top of the list here.
Now, I'll agree with you on Clemson. I actually think like you probably should have mentioned the fact that those two freshman wideouts for Clemson feel like they're starting to really put their fingerprints on games. And again, they lack that explosiveness against Georgia. I think if those two play at the level they're playing now, I'd kind of want to see that run back. Now, I don't know that it'd be totally different because, again, they're picking on some secondaries who I wouldn't say are the creme de la creme of college football.
Yeah. But
you are starting to see their impact, and that's something Clemson desperately needed in that game and didn't really have. I'm going to disagree on Tennessee, Texas A&M. I'm still such a Tennessee believer, and Nico's play is starting to scare me a little bit. I'll be honest, because like they're not even really asking him to do anything heroic. He's just like, there's some wide open guys down the field. He has to make those plays. Like that was the frustrating part about Joe Milton, and it's frankly why Hendon Hooker was.
I feel like the conversation with Nico and Joe Milton, it's getting eerily similar. Like, what are we saying with Nico? Hey, we've watched this.
I'm not ready to say that because Joe Milton was a fifth-year senior when he was making those mistakes. This is Nico's like, we're going into like his sixth start or something like that. So. Again, I've seen moments where he's been comfortable, he's been settled, and he's ripped it up. I thought the Oklahoma game was a good example of that. The beginning of that Florida game, he was doing some things. I'm a little concerned, frankly, about that offensive line breaking down in pass pro more than you'd like to see and then taking too many penalties and putting them behind the sticks. I still think this Tennessee defense is unbelievable. I think they would give Texas A&M a massive problem up front. I know you talk about A&M's offensive line improving, but I don't think we've seen anything like what Tennessee can bring from that defensive front. So I still love that defense, and frankly, their ability to run the ball. It's just been a problem because they've been taking penalties. But if they stop taking penalties and they get back to kind of being able to slam on teams, I think you can get a better version of Nico. So that, to me, haven't been clean games for this Tennessee team, but I still think their A-ball is better than Texas A&M right now.
They can run the football. They can play really good defense. Though I'm like, if Nico carves up Alabama on Saturday, I'm putting Tennessee back in like that national title conversation because there's so much you like about Tennessee, but the Tennessee fans know this too. It's gonna be hard to consistently win games when you have a quarterback that's playing so inconsistently. We'll see if he can turn it up because there's a lot. One thing I will say, Keenan Pili out for the year. That sucks because I think he's been really, really good for Tennessee at the linebacker spot. Dill, LSU, I would mark as another team that is trending up. That defense, our biggest question mark was the secondary. Like, can they run with Ole Miss down the field and make plays in the football without tackling the wide receiver and picking up flags? They did that. And like Blake Baker, you can tell that personnel development. Like these players seem to be more comfortable and getting better under Coach Blake Baker and this new staff. Keep an eye out for LSU. Notre Dame is kind of just in there on because I didn't really trust any other team to put in there. I have big time question marks about Notre Dame. You just lost Benjamin Morrison for the season, but at the end of the day, I do feel like that's that last team where like, all right, college football playoff team, and then we got question marks about like big question marks about some of these other teams. I'll start with this, Dill. Outside of like, I have some teams that I'm kind of lower on than consensus. Iowa State is probably that. Indiana is certainly that. Pitt might be that. The reason for me having those teams a little bit lower is I just don't know what these teams are. And I think Indiana is probably the best example where what Indiana eyeball test, Indiana's looked awesome, right? They're undefeated. They've taken care of business every single week. The problem is their best win is against Maryland. Maryland just lost to Northwestern at home by 3 scores. And so Indiana has looked great, but they have not played very good teams. So I'm going to give priority to the teams that I feel like I know who they are a little bit more. I think the same thing can go with Iowa State, where I just look at the Big 12 and say, I don't think the Big 12 is even close to some of the other conferences in the Power Four. Ole Miss.
I was just about to they're the tough one because they were the better team in both those games against Kentucky and LSU. I mean, They're taking good-sized leads into the fourth quarter. and they're just like melting down. I mean, they're giving up big plays on defense. Their offense, I don't know why they can't get some creativity back into that system. I look last year, like just look at that Peach Bowl game against Penn State. I was like, okay, Ole Miss is a top 4 team in the country. I was looking, they were spreading the ball around, they were hitting big plays, they were getting like just really consistently marching on a really good Penn State defense. And then you look to what they're doing this year. It's like, okay, well, we're just going to throw the ball deep, and if that doesn't work, we have no. It's really puzzling, I think, why Ole Miss is looking the way they are, especially because they're playing really good defense. And it's very frustrating to see them kind of blow it on the offense side of the ball.
That's the worst part if you're an Ole Miss fan, is I think this Ole Miss defense is legit, very, very good. And the Ole Miss offense is the reason they're losing these football games. Still, I feel like Lane
they're
Kiffin,
not dead. I don't like they're not dead yet. Like they can still they decrease their margin of error clearly. Like they'll have to go beat Georgia. They'll have to go win those big games, and they have no room to breathe, I don't think now.
No.
But it's still a team I look. They're very capable of doing it because their defensive line's great. And I know there's something good in that. I know that offense can be good. You'll never be able to tell me otherwise.
The problem is Lane Kiffin is basically what I do on Madden, and it's just run 4 verts. Like, it's a problem. And it wouldn't be as big of a problem if Jackson Dart was hitting some of these throws down the field, but Jackson Dart's been brutal, 20-plus yards down the field the last couple of weeks. So I look at Ole Miss and just, it's puzzling, man. BYU, very similar to Iowa State, very impressive. I mean, you look at BYU, and I think they should be ranked over Iowa State in the AP people, and maybe I should have had them over Iowa State in these rankings. You beat Kansas State badly in kind of a weird game, I'll admit. You go on the road and beat SMU. Again, the quarterback, they didn't make the switch at the quarterback yet. So, like, BYU's beaten some good teams, but they've been kind of weird games. I'll give BYU their flowers. Again, what I love about Iowa State and BYU, if we were to talk about these Big 12 teams in a kind of conversation, Iowa State and BYU, like, kind of know what you're going to get. Like, they've just been really, really solid and taking care of business. Now, I would say Kansas State has the highest ceiling of the teams in the Big 12, especially with Cam Rising just not going to play anymore. It sounds like maybe he'll come back for an 8th year. Shout out the kid, man. Should call him a man. He's a grown man. But I look at Kansas State and say they have the highest ceiling. They're a little bit more inconsistent than Iowa State and BYU, but I think they have the highest ceiling. So that's kind of how I look at the Big 12. Dill, Missouri's probably the other one where it's like, can you just play
another puzzler?
Yeah.
Why are they playing as poorly as they are? Because again, I look at those two Big 12 teams above them, like roster. It doesn't feel close to me. But again, you're looking at 2 teams in BYU and like just like you said, they're playing really consistent. And for whatever reason, Missouri can't kind of get themselves rolling. Their offense should be too good to be playing the way they're playing. They should be able to score every time they touch it, I think. The left side of the offensive line is probably what's giving me my main concern because I think that passing game will figure it out. But my God, that side of the line is playing really poorly. And in the SEC, you can't play that way, especially if you're going to be a team that's probably going to have to be led from the offense.
Yeah, Brady Cook's just stuck in neutral right now. Maybe just stuck in park, if we're being honest. I
don't think it's his fault, though. I think they're not helping him up front. He's not playing incredible, but they need to get it rolling up front. They're too good of an offensive line to play the way they are.
And that was the reason we had Missouri as a playoff team heading into the year. Like, we thought this offensive line was going to be a top 3 unit in the SEC. It hasn't played like that. And I would also, Brady Cook, pushing the ball down the field, completed 48% of his balls 20-plus yards down the field last year. That number's down to 25. They're just stuck in neutral right now. It's a team that I think can be competitive in the college football playoffs. There hasn't been a single game where I've watched Missouri and say, yeah, that's the college football playoff team. Not one game yet.
Now, let me get to my major contention. It's Michigan. I'm fine with Boise State. You don't need to – Ashton Genty's awesome. We all know he's awesome. I don't need to hear your reasoning for Boise State. I'm very good with that. When you have a team in Michigan who – and I'm a Michigan guy, alumni there. Like, I ride and die with Michigan. But that quarterback play is just beyond bad in terms of what you need at a minimum to be competitive. I mean, they've tried 3 different guys. All 3 of them have played, for lack of a better term, loser football. Like, in big moments, they don't make things happen. They don't get first downs. They turn the ball over. It's been so wildly frustrating. The offensive line is not good enough to kind of cover up for the mess that is the quarterback spot. And their secondary is not tackling. So those 3 things are kind of combined. That's not a top 25 team if you ask me. Now, maybe Tuttle will figure it out. He's kind of the saving grace at this point. But I look at that fourth quarter he played, that's loser football. And again, that's kind of where I'm at with Michigan. I do not see them as a top 25 team. I don't see how the AP still has them there. That's where I'm at.
And I was trying to explain this to you before we went live, and you kind of talked me out of it. Now I'm stuck with it. Like I'm ain't gonna let you bully me out of my take. But you are kind of right. You look at Jack Tuttle and say, I do think they found he's definitely the best quarterback that we've at least when we saw Jack Tuttle have those drives. That's by far the best this Michigan offense has looked. So I do think they might have their best quarterback. But what you said is so true. Like, yeah, the quarterback problem is by far the biggest problem with this Michigan team. The offensive line, nowhere near what we thought it was going to be. The defense,
and again, they had to turn over their 5 guys,
yeah,
so it's like you kind of expect some regression, but it's big regression.
Yeah, we thought it'd be okay. We thought it'd still be like a strength of this Michigan team, something they could lean on. It's not. It's just not. And then you look at the defense and say you thought it would. Like if you were a Michigan believer, which I talked myself into before the season, you said that's going to be a top 5 elite defense. That's going to keep them in a lot of football games. It's just not that under Wink Martindale. Now, granted, they've had a lot of injuries. They weren't playing very healthy against Washington, but at the same time, you said it best.
The offense also putting them in horrible positions, so they're not playing complimentary
football. But still, like eyeball tested. Like, is this the smothering defense, the elite defense that we saw as the national championship team? Absolutely not. So there are more questions than just the quarterback if you're a Michigan fan. Outside looking in, Dill, USC. I think that's probably your biggest content, I would guess, or probably the people in the comment section, maybe not yours. I look at USC and say, don't forget they beat LSU on a neutral site, a team that is a playoff caliber team right now. The loss against Michigan was like they should have won. Minnesota, you had a 7-point lead in the fourth quarter. You were leading Penn State in the fourth quarter as well. I'm not the shoulda, woulda, coulda kind of guy. Michigan, or USC, I should say, had leads in the fourth quarter in every single one of their losses that they've suffered. They just played Penn State, a team that you think is the number 3 team in the country, very, very close. It's frustrating that they're 3-3 for USC fans, but I really don't think this is that bad of a football team.
I'm comfortable with that one. My main contention here is you should have the Hogs, Arkansas Razorbacks. They should be in the dark horse category. If I had my druthers, I'd probably have them around 14 or 15. That's where I think they are. I think, again, the Taylor Green experience is kind of a tough one at times. Like
you gotta have stomach for it.
Like Oklahoma State, where he just, looks so good in one part of the game and then absolutely turns it on and like turns the ball over a zillion times right in a row and costs you a football game. But they play that. If he plays that way, he plays against Tennessee. They beat everyone in that dark horse category, and they probably inch themselves up into the top 10 because I think that defense under Travis Williams is playing ungodly good.
100%. The thing where I would argue with you about Arkansas is it's hard to put that team as a top 15
it's polar opposite of Iowa State and BYU, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, 100%. It's like the when you get the peak Taylor Green, and there's a big sample size that Taylor Green can be a baller going back to Boise State, but there's also a large sample size of Taylor Green being the Taylor Green we saw in the second half against Oklahoma State. That's my main contention. Is like I don't want to put Arkansas. It's just what Taylor Green shows up every single week. I do think you have some other question marks specifically on the offensive line, but you're right. Like when Taylor Green's playing Taylor Green ball, good Taylor Green ball.
Line played good. They played some physical ball against Tennessee. That's some old Pittman, like Georgia, nasty offensive line play. I was really impressed by what they were doing, frankly.
Yeah, and then it's the same conversation because then you go to the Texas A&M game and say they got the tails whooped, and so it's like
the Arkansas experience. I'd take that over a team that you just know can't really compete.
Yeah, that's
okay. They'll drop the gross one for you for sure, but they can compete with anyone.
We said that we said that heading in. I remember that conversation where it's like, hey, at least for Arkansas, like it's gonna be must watch television. Like you ain't turning the football game off when Taylor Green's playing like that.
Well, you might turn it off quickly because he can.
Cooper. That's fair. All right, we'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.